So tonight we are having a discussion on tax and especially on the taxation of the digital economy. Quite an interesting topic. We had touched on it the last time. We were speaking about Africa and tax. And tonight again, I'm joined by Darlington, who is the Commissioner for Domestic Taxes in Liberia. I'll let him introduce himself and then we will go right into the discussion. Darlington, welcome.
Thank you, Christine. Like you said, I'm the Commissioner for Taxes here at the Liberia Revenue Authority in Liberia. I've been in this capacity now for the past 8 going to 9 years. In tax administration, I'm pretty running to 15 years right now. So I think quite some experience right now. But yeah, thank you, Christine.
Okay. So definitely everyone expects to get a wealth of information and experience from this discussion with Darlington. So to get us started, tonight we want to speak about the OECD proposal on taxation of the digital economy, and then we will look at that, how that affects African countries. And this is especially if we get to the point where we are saying that the OECD proposal is binding to the African countries, or if it's not binding. So if it's binding, then we will dig deeper to see what that means for African countries. So I personally practice tax, and this is a topic that is of keen interest to me. I'm actually doing my research on it. So it's very interesting to have this discussion. So Darlington, I'll let you start off by giving a general overview of what the OECD proposed solution is, what is the digital economy, and where all this discussion about taxing the digital economy and the OECD started, and where the two come in. Like, why is OECD interested in taxing the digital economy, and who is OECD to begin with, for someone who doesn't know? Darlington?
Yeah, so let's, like you said, so I'll try to put it in context in a short space of time as much as possible, because it's such a complex topic, right? So the OECD is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. It's a European-based organization that is a major player in the international tax arena, in addition to works done by the United Nations Special Committee on Tax that has been constituted over a couple of years by the General Assembly of the United Nations. So in 2013, the group of 20 nations thought about the challenges that were being posed by trading over the digital space. So then they charged the OECD with coming up with some proposals in how to solve some of the challenges that were occurring as a result of trade through the digital space. So in 2019, the OECD, in a public consultation document, came up with three basic approaches to solving the problems or solving the tax challenges of digitization of the economy. And these three were known as: one, the marketing intangibles, user participation, and the significant economic presence that a multinational had in a particular jurisdiction. As a result of these public consultations, the OECD did not find a consensus, and then it decided to come up with a unified approach. So they did that in what it is now called Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 of the OECD addresses to solve the problems arising as a result of digitizing the economy. Now, Pillar 1 has to do with those multinational entities whose income or whose annual turnover is around 20 billion or exceeds globally 20 billion euros. Now, there are two basic thresholds that Pillar 1 speaks about. Now, it has this revenue threshold of 20 billion. And then, in order to have a nexus to a particular country, that multinational must have a profit to tax revenue of over 10%. Now, for a particular country, for a nexus to occur between the multinational and a taxing jurisdiction, 20 to 30% of the 10% of the revenue, right, must be attributed to that country, meaning the market jurisdiction. Now, the so-called market jurisdiction and the so-called country of residence. For countries, say like for a particular country to participate or to exercise its taxing right. So let's go back a bit. Pillar 1, Pillar 2, OECD Pillar 1, Pillar 2. Pillar 1 has to do with allocation of taxing rights between source country and country of residence. And Pillar 2 has to do with the minimum tax rule. So in order for a country to exercise on Pillar 1 its taxing right, the MAE must generate a revenue of about 1 million from that jurisdiction. Or if the country has a GDP of less than 4 billion euros, the MAE must generate a revenue of about 250,000 euros for the nexus rule to be established in order for a market jurisdictions to exercise its taxing right over that transaction. So, like I said, it's a bit complex. So, if we bring it in the context, say, of Africa, or say Kenya specifically, so in order for Kenya to participate in order for Kenya to exercise its taxing right over a M&E, right, that trades through the digital space, the M&E must generate a revenue of about 1 million from Kenya. And the M&E must have a global turnover of not less than 20 billion euros. And the M&E must have a profit to revenue ratio of not less than 10%. That will ensure Kenya exercising its taxing right for whatever transaction that MAE has in Kenya. And like I said, in order for Kenya to participate in what the rule calls the residual profit, that Kenya must at least have about 20 to 30% of the revenue exceeding the 10% revenue threshold. So it's a bit complex. One of the things that this OECD rule has is the complexity of it, right? The complexity of one, understanding it, and two, the application of the rules. But that's in a summary, that's what Pillar 1 is, Christine.
Okay. As anyone listening to this, you may wonder what exactly is this that we are speaking about. But I think, as Darlington is saying, there's some complexity in this. But to break it down a bit, so when we say an M&E, which is an in-scope M&E, which has met the threshold that Darlington has said, which is that it's making a global revenue of 20 billion euros, so that it can come within the scope of even the entities that we are speaking about, being possible to be taxed by market jurisdictions. We think, for instance, is something an entity like Facebook. So Facebook, for Kenya to be able to tax Facebook's profits, Facebook must make a global revenue of 20 billion euros. And then, in addition to that, Facebook must derive at least 1 million euros of revenue from Kenya. And even further, to go further, for Kenya to be able to be allocated any revenue, that is coming from Facebook. Then there's the next rule of the percentage of profitability of, I said 25% of the residual profit must exceed, I think Darlington put it much better than I would there, on the quantum of how much can be allocated to Kenya. In short, the situation as has been proposed is such that the MNEs that can be taxed are very few, because Darlington, I don't know if it would be right to say that very few MNEs would fall in the category where they're making global turnovers of 20 billion euros. Well, of course, the most profitable ones are. That's one. But even when we're speaking about MNEs, initially it was just going to be digital MNEs that are making these global revenues. But right now it's all MNEs, excluding the extractive sector and the financial sector. What that means is that we are not only speaking about MNEs that can make this sort of revenues from the digital sector. They could also be in other sectors, as long as it's not financial or extractive, so that they can fall within the scope of this. So, which again, there's a bit of complexity in that, but then also is that these rules were initially going to be targeted at the digital economy. But towards the end of the discussion at the OECD, when the US came in, the US said that if they are only targeted at the digital businesses, then they will be against the interest of the US, because a majority of the big digital businesses are US resident companies. So they said that their proposal is that the MNEs that fall within scope, whose profits can be reallocated to market jurisdictions throughout the world, need not just be digital businesses, but they could be other businesses, as long as they're not within the financial or the extractive sector. I was hoping to make this a bit easy, but I don't think there's another way to just really break it down in a much easier sense.
Exactly. It's just so complex. But I love what the ATAF counter proposal is, because like you rightly said, if the 20 billion threshold remains, that means almost all African countries that have signed up to the rule, right, will not tax the residual profit. But the ATAF is proposing that the global turnover should not be greater than 250 million euros, which is far, far less, which is in the scope of most African government GDPs. So I think with ATAF proposal, which was not taken into consideration, most African countries who have taxed the MAE operating in the country. And just to add to what you said, granted, I agree. And that which my personal opinion on the expansion beyond the digital economy, right, to expand the scope generally. I think it even puts African countries in a more precarious position in terms of its ability to exercise its taxing rights, because 20 billion euros turnover for a global the global turnover for an MNE will definitely put African countries at a disadvantage. That's why we agree with ATAF that the rule should have been 250 million euros, which would have fallen into line with most African countries' GDP instead of the 250 billion euros. And then also the next factor. An MAE operating a 1 million euro revenue from an economy before the market jurisdiction exercise or can even think about exercising its taxing rights. So if you ask me whether it will put more revenue into the coffers of African countries, I don't think so. I don't think so. Like I said from the beginning, I think the rules are still complex. And then $250 billion turnover. I think like countries like Liberia is too huge. Yeah.
Yeah, but Darlington, even for a country like Kenya, because I was looking at in the year 2021, Kenya's GDP was placed at US dollar 100 billion. 100, it's within the threshold of, it's above the 40 billion euros. So like Kenya would need, because it's not in the lower GDP category, for Kenya to be able to tax some of these profits, the entities would need to derive more than 1 million euros from Kenya. Because you see that disadvantages it, because one, how do you even determine, for instance, let's focus on the digital economy, that Facebook has derived 1 million euros from Kenya? It could be that it can derive such incomes from Kenya. Netflix could, YouTube could, but look at the situation of how these digital businesses operate. Facebook will target Kenyan people for advertising. So and how this happens is that if you want to promote a post that you've done on Twitter, what you do is that when you click the promote button, you choose your audience. I in Kenya can choose my audience to be in Liberia. So I'm a Kenyan advertiser who is targeting users in Liberia. And then what Facebook does is that it targets for me those people based on their likes, their clicks, their history of search, so that I am paying Facebook from Kenya, and the cost is quite low in Kenya shilling, and I'm targeting users in Liberia. So in such a case, where is the income really being derived from? Is it being derived from me who is paying, or from the users who are being targeted and who are the true audience who is enabling Facebook to earn this income? And I think it's such things when you say that these businesses are deriving this amount of income from a country. How do you determine, or even consider something like Netflix? Someone is streaming this revenues. How they are paid is that you have your credit card, which is being deducted on these amounts. First of all, the government has no visibility of how much Netflix is getting from their country. So we really are entirely going to rely on Netflix to tell us, to give a global breakdown of every single country where they are in, to say this is how much revenue I got from Liberia, this is how much I got from South Africa, this is how much I got from Uganda. And then based on what is given, then we can say that you're falling within threshold or you're not falling within threshold.
Some data from Facebook statistics in 2020. The revenue from Facebook alone for the region US and Canada was about $40.5 billion, right? For Africa or the rest of the world, it was around $7.6 billion. Mm-hmm. Now, if further decomposing into individual African countries, it will even be far less than the 1 million euro revenue turnover that should be attributed to a particular market jurisdiction. Now, so further research shows that the internet users in Africa is just about 11.5% of the worldwide internet users in the world. So the actors in the digital economy, those multinational enterprises, will forever, in my opinion, it says, will forever not be taxed in any African country, if I say that.
True.
Right. Yeah. So it completely rather puts us, as developing countries in Africa, completely puts us at a disadvantage. That's why I think Kenya and Nigeria I remember are the two African countries that did not sign up to the rules back in July of 2021. Yeah. So because Kenya had this digital service tax, I think about 5%. Nigeria did not. But Nigeria, one of the reasons Nigeria did not participate in this Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 rules of the OECD was one that the banning arbitration clause, right, that will arise, that potentially will arise as a result of some dispute during the implementation of the rules. Nigeria said that contradicted or that came into conflict with its domestic law. So it could not participate. Kenya said that it puts Kenya at a disadvantage because, like I said, it will take a long time for Kenya to exercise its taxing right over a particular jurisdiction. What I even think put most African countries at a disadvantage is extending the rules beyond the digital space. Right. So if an MAE comes and operates physically in Liberia, you are saying to us that the MAE should not be taxed in Liberia until those rules, all right, as complex as they are, are satisfied or are met. So, I mean, would that put, like I said, would that enable African countries to generate or to domestically mobilize revenue? I don't think so.
Yeah, no. Actually, Darlington, I also think, as you said, it's not like, for instance, Facebook is not deriving any income from these African countries. Based on the statistics that you're giving, they're actually deriving good income when you compare by the African standard from these African countries. Yet you're told, because you haven't met a threshold that has been put for you to qualify to tax Facebook, you should not tax, just because someone has set a threshold. That's the problem. And then, even as you're saying, there's other multinationals. Consider like General Electric. Yeah, GE has offices all over in Africa offering different things. It's a multinational. Or consider Coca-Cola. Let's pick Coca-Cola for instance. So you're told that if it's like one of these in-scope entities, let's say Coca-Cola is able to derive this 20 billion euros in revenue globally, then you're told then Coca-Cola falls within the scope, and then you're told you cannot tax Coca-Cola because unless your revenue in that Coca-Cola is deriving from your jurisdiction is 1 million euros. I mean, these rules, in honesty, I think it's very skewed against African countries. And I like what the initial direction that OECD had taken about the market intangibles, the significant economic presence, such directions and user participation. I think that was somewhat a more fair way of looking at some of the things. Like for instance, like the European Commission, when they wanted to introduce the European Digital Service Tax, they are looking at how many users do you have in a country. Like for instance, the users located in Uganda, for instance, can we trace and see like a user is creating value by accessing these platforms in Uganda? Then you can set and say, if this number of users are in Uganda, then you have created nexus for yourself. And now this entity that has created nexus for itself, then it should account for the tax in certain number of ways, which is how the Kenyan Digital Service Tax is working. So under the Kenya's Digital Service Tax is such that if a user is in Kenya, and this is determined, for instance, if the payment is coming from a Kenyan bank account, if the IP address is located in Kenya, if the download is happening within, also again, on an IP address in Kenya, or, like there's any way you can link the transaction to Kenya, then that user is determined to be in Kenya. And that entity which is deriving that income is deemed to be driving and accruing income from Kenya, which becomes taxable under the Kenyan Income Tax Act, and it's supposed to account for 1.5 for tax at 1.5% of the gross revenue that it's earning from Kenya. So things like the streaming services like Netflix, YouTube, as long as the user who has clicked on YouTube is using an IP address registered to Kenya, YouTube is required to either look for a representative in Kenya and account for 1.5% as tax on its gross revenue that's is earning from Kenya. Of course, it's and the UK digital service tax is also similarly structured, only that in the UK it's not all services as wide as the Kenyan one, and also there's a revenue threshold. In the UK, the entity must derive a certain amount of revenue from the UK for it now to be subject to the digital services tax in the UK. But Darlington, it's quite peculiar how things moved from just the digital businesses to things, to other entities, and you're saying now we should not even tax these other entities unless they meet this threshold. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Because the initial challenge that the initial challenges rather that were targeted to be solved were the challenges posed as a result of trading through the digital space. But then the scope just got expanded. So, my thoughts are that on the one hand, African countries are being encouraged to domestically mobilize revenue for sustainable growth and development in concert with the Sustainable Development Goal of the United Nations. On the other hand, the major champion of international taxation in the international arena is drawing up rules that are counterintuitive to and developing countries' ability to generate more revenue to provide public services to its people. Where do I mean? So that's why I normally say to some of the fora we go to. I think some of the stance from the African Tax Administration Forum, supported by the AU, should grow more louder. Like so if you see what the Europeans do, so the group, the G20, the G7, and even the EU Commission as a whole, they have a strong voice. They take part strongly in the narrative of the international tax arena. Should the AU do same? I think the AU should be even more louder because we are the so-called market jurisdictions in Africa. Right. And then we in Africa need the revenue to provide the public services. I'm saying that that's why I'm saying that African countries, especially the AU, should be more proactive in these discussions than they are currently. Our voice should be even more louder than we are currently. Because why should we be told how to tax transactions in our own economy?
Yeah, Darlington, I agree. And I think the other thing to say is that the especially on the digital side, like Europe, the US, they are mature markets. Meaning, like if you consider like Amazon, the market is becoming saturated. So they are looking for more emerging and new markets where they can launch to. Darlington, you agree that Africa is rich. It's an opportunity for anyone who is looking to explore the digital economy, because as you said, the internet penetration is still not that much big yet. E-commerce hasn't peaked that much yet. Other than like maybe the Africa like within Africa, there's like Jumia. In Africa, there's not much of like Amazon set up here. Some
Yeah.
countries like maybe South Africa have their own domestic e-commerce platforms, but the digital economy within Africa is very it's left to be exploited. And therefore I would say, as you're saying, especially through the Africa Union and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, if Africa were able to come up with a single digital market where when you are speaking about thresholds, don't look at the threshold of Liberia, don't look at the threshold of Djibouti, who is very small. Djibouti, in their GDP, they will never even meet the 250,000 euros to be able to tax at all. Not that most African countries, in any case, really will not be able to. So if Africa had a common digital market, while you're saying, when you speak about Africa and the digital economy, you're speaking not about one single country, but the whole of the African continent, then there will be greater negotiating power. So that if, even for instance, Facebook or let's say Amazon says that we will not supply Kenya because they have a digital service tax, if it's within across Africa, telling them then it's fine, don't supply to any African country, there's greater pinch to them. It's not just a small country that they're saying we will not supply to. So I agree. The African Union, though, can take this up, even if it's a bit encouraging because of ATAF and what ATAF is able to do, and ATAF seems to be making quite some good headway with having the Africa Union appoint them as the key tax experts for the African continent. But I think it's to just give it a bit more backup, so that even
Yeah.
in the negotiations, to have Africa Union speak and say, like, listen to ETAF, and to have African governments, when, like, for instance, the Kenya Free Trade Area with the US is being negotiated, to put clauses there that suggest that there's an Africa Union and there's ETAF, and so that Kenya does not first go and negotiate for its own digital trade agreements with the US, but
Exactly. I mean, so if you notice what the Europeans do, so they have these various directives. So what the OECD would do, the European Union, as I know, as a political geo entity, they domesticate those rules, not necessarily accepting all of them, but they domesticate those rules and give them as directives to the individual members to adhere to. So the European Union as a geopolitical entity is following closely the narrative that comes out of the OECD. That's what I anticipate that the AU will do. Right. Right now, some of the directives are still being championed by the OECD on the African continent. The directives on transfer pricing, the directives on exchange of information for tax purposes, the directive on the digitalization or how to address the challenges coming out of the digital economy. All those conversations are being led by the OECD. Where is the African Union or where is ETAF that should be championing all these things? So, I mean, I believe in order for us, I know the most African countries, like I said, except Nigeria and Kenya, from my best recall of thoughts, have not signed off to Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 of the OECD rules. But almost all African countries have. Is it too late? I don't think so. I think we can still be more louder on where the African voice is concerned through the AU or through ETA.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that where Pillar 1 is concerned, we're still at a disadvantage. Even though out of scope, the extractive sector and the regulated financial sector are out of scope, but there are several more industries that are in scope that will put the market jurisdiction at a major disadvantage where exercising the taxing rights are concerned.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that we still need to exert more efforts through the AU and ETA in order for the African voice to be heard, in order for us to ensure that more of our taxing rights, right, are exercised by market jurisdictions.
Mm.
Because to a large extent, they say we are, we are net importers of capital. Granted, so these capitals are exploited here in Africa. Returns on these capitals are received from from those exploitations that have been done in Africa. It is only fair that those returns are taxed accordingly in the market's jurisdiction that they are exploited from. I think it's fair.
Yeah.
And so in order for us to, like I said, in order for us to get and not to have this major disadvantage that I think the African countries will get out of Pillar 1, I think we should still be louder through the AU and through ETA.
Yeah, and yes, Kenya and Nigeria did not sign. You're right in the recollection, and I also think if African countries, I was surprised to actually see countries like South Africa signed it. The ones that you think they might give a bit of a pushback, but they did sign on it. And if it was negotiated in such a way that it wasn't each individual African country signing, but maybe the Africa Union or through ETAF is the one that was signing, I think there might have been a greater pushback. But I also I think that these in-scope entities, even if the extractive sector, the regulated financial services are out, there's quite a big part of the service sector which if the entities are able to fall within that scope of 20 billion euros, then they fall within that. And within the service sector, this could very greatly impact the how you tax these entities in Africa. And anyone could fall within that service sector. Of course, I'm not certain of their revenue thresholds, but think of like people within the hospitality sectors, like the big hotels across Africa. Think about like the providers of consulting services across Africa, maybe audit services. These ones, they could fall within the scope, and then you'll be told at that point you can no longer tax them other than through Pillar 1. And then I think also what happens is that there's an unfair advantage that's being given to foreign entities over domestic entities. And in this way, consider that if the small entities even across Africa, let's even think of the big e-commerce platform in Africa, Jumia. So let's say Jumia will never fall within scope. Within scope of this 20 billion euros turnover. So it's likely that it will have to keep being taxed out of the Pillar 1, meaning that, well, African countries are allowed to tax these small entities. The global ones, the big multinationals, will slip out. And I think that gives quite an unfair advantage to some entities over others. And the argument has always been the reason why the digital service tax should not be applied is because it disadvantages like foreign businesses. Like the digital service tax in Kenya only applies to foreign businesses because domestic businesses are subject to corporate tax in Kenya as other businesses.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But now the reason why the target of the digital service tax is foreign businesses is because foreign businesses are not falling within the tax bracket of Kenya. That's why the digital service tax is targeting them. But the argument has always been that the foreign entities are being unfairly targeted. But the OECD Pillar 1, I think, is disadvantaging domestic businesses over multinationals. And I don't know what, Darlington, you think about that. Especially imagine someone within the service sector who falls within the scope of Pillar 1, and you're told you cannot tax them. Well, someone who is so small within the same service sector in Liberia is being taxed under the domestic corporation tax. They really are at a great disadvantage. One can unfairly compete because they are not paying tax, while the small one cannot compete, and it's already barely making it. So I think other than even making it difficult to mobilize tax, it's disadvantaging domestic companies.
Yeah, completely agree with you. So statistics also show that there are around 281 million online shoppers in Africa. And like you said, a majority internally, domestically, they shop through Jumia and other online platforms. Right. But like you said, they are subject to the domestic tax rules in the various jurisdictions in Africa. And again, if a resident entity operating in a market jurisdiction is not subject to the same rules as the local entity, granted, they will be at a disadvantage. They will definitely be at a disadvantage. Because so when Amazon can come and generate revenue in Kenya or in Liberia or in Nigeria and not being taxed at the same rate because of these complex rules, because of these thresholds, as Jumia and other online platforms are taxed in their local jurisdictions, obviously these local platforms will be at a disadvantage because these international MNEs, these multinationals, they might be providing more incentives for ordinary citizens in Africa or in some African countries to use their platforms other than the local platforms that are being and that are available to use on the African continent. Right. So I mean, so again, I mean that's where all of the complexities, all of the disadvantages of Pillar 1, for market jurisdictions are concerned. Again, most countries in Africa were not given the time enough to go through these materials, digest these materials, discuss these materials with relevant policymakers in the country before making an informed decision as to should I sign up or should I not sign up? What are the advantages or what are the disadvantages if I don't sign up or if I sign up? And then all of a sudden, when the rules were being further drafted for implementation after they were signed up to in July of 2021, October of 2020 began the crafting of the implementation rules. Then all of these in scope, not in scope, beyond, I mean the scope beyond the digital economy, all of them came into being. Then it became more clearer as to what we're signed up for, what we're not signed up for. Are they to provide more revenue to the African countries or the market jurisdictions as they term it, or not? So it became even more clearer that we don't think that revenue would be even more mobilized from market jurisdiction, or market jurisdiction will not have the ability to exercise their taxing rights that are allocated to them as a result of all these thresholds, as a result of all these complexities that are expressed under Pillar 1 of the OECD rules.
Yeah, I agree. Darlington, it was very rushed. It almost happened like the US. You have been discussing this all along. OECD deserts the three initial approaches, picks up another one. Just when you're starting to understand it, a new rule is introduced before you even decide that, what are we going to do as a country. The US comes, says that the in-scope entities are not just digital but all the businesses. Before you realize what this means for your other non-digital businesses, which you possibly are not even focused on, it's too late. Years
It's too late.
Yeah,
It's absolutely too late.
then you're just given a document to sign.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Anyway, but I think we could go on and on, but I hope anyone listening to this, you possibly think through it. Think through what is really the situation we are dealing with right here. It's the revenue mobilization that Africa is skewed against Africa. It has always been skewed against source countries, but right now it's in fact even giving greater mileage, if you ask me, to these resident countries. But even more than that is what it's doing to the local industries and companies who are trying to come up, and you're competing with someone who even your government cannot put their hand onto tax because they have been exempt by this global in the air entity that has set a threshold. It's quite an interesting discussion and some thoughts you can have there. Darlington, you can give your closing remarks and then we will wrap it up for tonight.
Well, like you said, so we could go on with with this interesting topic, but I think what African countries should do is to further strengthen their domestic laws, domestic rules. And there's a possibility of what they call treaty override, where the latter of a law can trump a previous law on a domestic jurisdiction. Is that a route for some African countries to further to override some treaty provisions under the OECD rules? Might be. Because, like I said, my opinion is that it's about high time that we move away from this dependency syndrome and look within to mobilize our own revenue. And some of the ways to mobilize it is through taxing the digital economy and taxing it rightly. Am I a proponent of bilateral imposition of tax on the digital economy versus multilateralism? It's a good school of thought. I'm in between the two schools of thought. Because multilateralism, on the one hand, could put market jurisdiction at some disadvantage when it's not negotiated well. Bilateral imposition could say, I mean, this is my country, this is where you trade. and as a result of your commercial or financial activities being occurring in my country, so it should be taxed according to my domestic rules. Is that a good way to go? Again, I'm indifferent to the two, but my parting words is that let's continue to strengthen our domestic rules and let the AU being led on where taxation is concerned, ATA be even more louder to ensure that we exercise African countries, whether is the continent speaking at one first or individual African countries, but let's ensure that we are not put at the disadvantage where Pillar One, where the rules under Pillar One of the OECD standard on taxation of the digital economy, which has now been expanded to cover other sectors and beyond the digital space is concerned, that we can exert more of our rights in order to mobilize more revenue and provide more public services to our individual people in where individual countries on the African continent is concerned. So that would be my parting words, Christine, and thank you so much for such interesting, intriguing topic. I think it was a great time.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Darlington. And I think we will pick up on Pillar 2. Pillar 2 is not entirely bad, if you ask me. It has some good proposals there, especially
Yeah, I have similar perception. Yeah, definitely.
especially on the global minimum tax, and also like how you can exempt certain transactions from the agreements, from the double tax agreements, especially where there's abuse of treaty and failure to pay tax, all that. But we could pick up that a bit more, and also on the discussion that you just hinted on, whether it's a multilateral approach or bilateral approach. Very interesting, because you see there's some, I think, Asian countries who are trying to negotiate like almost bilateral kind of agreement on the digital side. They're trying to look for such a solution, which I think it's quite interesting to watch and see how it happens. But it was very nice to have this chat, and we hope anyone who listens to this, at least they can think through it and see what real options are out there for Africa to explore. But from us for today, we say goodbye, and thank you very much for those who listen to this.